Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and in the last couple of weeks I've done a couple of videos discussing training, physiques, and things like that of people in the ancient world, more ancient times, and I'll link some of that for you guys here in the annotations. I'll link them down below. I did one the other day talking about Milo of Croton and the whole story of the bull that goes back to ancient Greece, a very, very famous story, oftentimes told in exercise science classes, because it was documented going back to over 2,000 years ago. And then someone asked me in the Q&As the other day if I could discuss the physiques and the training styles of knights and things in the Middle Ages, and so I covered some of that for you guys. So check that out if you guys are interested in these sort of topics. But someone had also asked me in that question if I could discuss gladiators. Well, gladiators and knights are going to be two completely different things. We actually know quite a bit about the Roman gladiators, because the Romans were so meticulous in their documentation. It was recent enough in time that we have all these excavation sites. We've been able to study the bones and things of some of the gladiators, so we know quite a bit about their diets. It seems to match the historical records. We know quite a bit about their methods, what their bodies look like, why they did what they did. So there's actually a lot of historical information available on this, and it's pretty interesting. Now, number one, the diets of these guys are subject to a lot of debate, not so much what they ate, but why they ate it. And I've seen historians try to claim, no, they preferred these foods just so they could fatten up more. But other people have pointed out that basically the Roman gladiators were slaves. Even though they were glorified and they were beloved by the people, beloved by the emperor, these men were slaves. More importantly, they were slaves who required an enormous amount of calories for a number of reasons, and so they were given lower fare grains. They were given barley instead of some of the other foods that mainstream people in the area ate. In fact, people there ate a lot of meat. The gladiators didn't get a lot of meat, surprisingly enough. But the thing is, people need to realize is that when you're taking in a massive calorie surplus, getting a lot of protein from meat simply isn't a requirement to build muscle and strength. Is the lower your calories go, the more important these things start to become. It's like I've discussed with you guys in the past, getting really lean, getting lean at all while maintaining your muscle mass requires a lot more protein in your diet than gaining muscle does. Well, these guys didn't eat a lot of meat according to the records that we have. They lived on big vats of stews made mostly with barley and beans. So normally high fiber foods, it's actually fairly difficult to get fat on, but they force fed themselves basically. I mean, sumo wrestlers today do that. So they consumed enormous amounts of calories this way, and they force fed themselves even on these high fiber diets. And the reason they needed to do that is that they did a lot of conditioning and strength work, but they also needed to be fat. The gladiators had learned after a couple centuries of doing this, they had learned that the fatter you were, the higher your chance of surviving the fight. And again, there were only so many gladiators there. They didn't want them to all die every single fight. Now, you might see that in movies, but the truth is it wasn't always about the last man standing. It was about putting on a spectacular show. And a guy who's got a couple of inches of extra fat to slice through, it makes a lot bloodier of a mess. It makes a big mess for the crowd to enjoy and scream and cheer about because they see this big gory mess when they get cut. But it protects them. It protects their nerves. It protects their muscles so that you can make shallower cuts that don't actually cause any permanent injury. I mean, you could die from infection, but overall the injuries were going to be less horrendous, even though they would look gorier and bloodier. So it was all about putting on a show for these guys. They were showmen. Probably the dangerous show on earth because you are being slashed with swords and spears and axes. But it was a show nonetheless, and that layer of fat allowed them to put on a much, much better show while surviving, having a much higher survival rate. And obviously the death rate was pretty high no matter what, due to lack of antibiotics from all these cuts and still being, hit with weapons by men who were angry and attacking you who were strong. But the thing to remember is that entertainment was the point at the end of the day, and just like he asked in the Gladiator movie, if you guys recall that movie, are you not entertained? Well, that was the whole point. It wasn't for all the men to necessarily die. They wanted to live. Oftentimes, the owners of the gladiators wanted them to live if at all possible because they were a valuable slave and not always easy to replace. It took time to train them up, to get them big enough, strong enough, all of that. There was a lot of effort involved. They didn't want them to die unnecessarily. Now, oftentimes they needed to because Caesar would order it, but they needed to live if at all possible. And that big layer of fat was an enormous component there. Now, The other thing is that these guys trained really hard. They had to do a lot of training. Now, in their downtime, they got plenty of rest and everything, but they had to do a lot of GPP work because they needed good conditioning. They needed to be able to get up and fight and put on a good show and be athletic. So they did large amounts of GPP. They obviously didn't have structured weightlifting programs like we have, but they lifted heavy objects, they wrestled, they grappled, they fought with weapons. So their overall conditioning was really high while having to put on a large amount of fat. So they had to consume very, very large amounts of food. And I think most of us, when we look at these high satiety foods that they ate, these are foods most of us would use for fat loss today. Because again, barley is the highest fiber grain on demand. Beans are enormous in fiber. It is difficult to overeat these foods, yet they did. And it's really interesting that they were able to do so. I'm sure it was not an easy task, and it took some getting used to. And it does go to show you guys that no matter how clean you eat or how high of fiber that you guys eat today, it is possible to gain fat if you're just willing to eat enough food. So even the guys who claim, oh, when I eat clean, I can't eat enough food to gain weight, the Roman gladiators would laugh at them. That's absolutely hilarious because these guys didn't have access to junk food or empty calories at all. Now, another thing that they did was one of the things that we noted is due to their diet. They had a lack of calcium in their diet. They didn't always get the minerals they needed. And you have guys who are getting bone injuries and things. They needed to heal quickly. And one of the things that they had figured out is that they consumed a drink made of ashes. So they were not only known as barley warriors from all the barley they consumed, but they also consumed this disgusting drink made of ash. And the interesting thing with this drink they consumed is that it contained, from the records that we can see, we've actually found the records of this and it's been analyzed, that it contained large amounts of calcium and magnesium. Well, what are bones made out of? Calcium and magnesium. And so this made up for the deficiencies in their diet by consuming this ash beverage that they consumed. So overall, in a lot of ways, there's nothing glorious about what these guys had to do. Not only did they have to pretty much force themselves to consume, while doing all this conditioning work and GPP work, enough calories from high fiber stews in order to gain not only muscle but large amounts of fat, inches and inches of fat. Again, most of these guys were probably in the 30% body fat range, which is pretty rare for an athletic person in the ancient world. But then they consumed this horrific ash beverage that they drank, made of basically ash water and other things mixed in, just so that they could get enough minerals in for their bones to heal. So their diet is pretty interesting in its own right. And again, it was very specific to what they needed and their needs at the time. But their diet sounds pretty horrific. And what people need to remember, this isn't the same sort of ancient time you're thinking of with the hardships of the Middle Ages. The Roman Empire was prosperous. Roman citizens did not starve to death. They were well cared for. They were an empire. So people within the empire actually got all the foods and everything they needed imported. Starvation was very, very rare. They had a true welfare type state. So at the expense of all the nations that they conquered around them. And you've got to remember, the actual gladiators were deep inside the empire. This was part of Rome. So it's not like you would say, well, at least they were well fed in a time where people weren't. No, not really. The Roman citizens fared much, much better. They had access to a lot more meat, higher quality grains than these gladiators did. So the gladiators really didn't have it that good as you would think of it compared to the other people living in the exact same cities and region that they were in. So no, it wasn't necessarily a nice life. And at the end of the day, you've got to remember that they were slaves, and they were slaves who knew that their ability to gain muscle, to gain fat, their ability to perform in the arena and impress the emperor was going to be enormous, and whether they as an individual got to live or die. Because these men knew if the emperor put a thumbs down on them, that it was game over. So that's the other interesting point. You know, people will say things like, well, I struggle to eat enough food to gain weight. And going back to that point, well, when your life actually depends on it, that you know that you have to train hard every day for hours every day, burn through all these calories, and you still have to consume enough clean foods. These are, again, really what you think of as bro foods or clean foods. They're eating tons of barley and beans, ultra high fiber carb sources. If you knew that your life was going to depend upon your ability to get to 30% body fat while consuming clean foods, you would find a way to choke that stuff down. In addition to the fact that they had to choke down this nasty, horrific ash drink. So it's really amusing when people discuss certain things with diets and willpower and everything. Well, I suppose if your life is on the line, you'll find a way to do it. But when we really look at the Roman gladiators, this goes to show us that what we're seeing is really kind of the equivalent of the modern NFL player in a way. These guys had to be big, they had to have extra fat, they had to train all day, and they had to consume a rather interesting diet in light of all of the factors around it to get there. And they had the external motivation to push them. That's the thing that people need to realize. Willpower is not always what you think it is. Willpower is oftentimes about motivation, and just like the NFL players are motivated by millions of dollars in glory, these gladiators were motivated by, again, the glory of the crowd, but also their own very life on the line. And when your life is on the line, you'll find a way to stick to sometimes the most horrific diet you've ever seen in order to reach your goals. And these men did it successfully, or they died. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. If you guys enjoyed this video, please remember to click like down below. Please subscribe if you haven't and share it with others. So I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.